Retro.
What's up, guys? This is Daniel Logan, Boba Fett from Attack of the Clones, The Clone Wars, Book of Boba, Skywalker Saga game, and hopefully many more things in the Star Wars galaxy. You are listening to Jay and Dennis on Podcast Stardust. Yep, this is the way I've spoken.
Welcome to Podcast Stardust. This is the fully armed and operational podcast dedicated to Star Wars news, reviews, and discussion. I am Dennis Keithley.
And I'm Jay Krebs.
And it's a new week, and that means that we're starting things off with another episode of the Clone Wars as part of our rewatch. But before we get into the shenanigans on Nal Hutta, Jay, you want to remind everybody where we can be found on social media?
You have no idea how bad I want to do a Snootles accent, but I will spare everyone. We are on Facebook and Instagram at Podcast Stardust.
Yeah, and I'll spare everybody from reading this like Ziro the Hutt. So the dish is aligned, the signal's boosted to maximum output, the shield is down, and we are now broadcasting to the galaxy. So we are up to episode 9 from season 3 of the Clone Wars, and that is the Hunt for Ziro. And this is... I'm going to have you read the summary in just a second, but we've been talking about how like everything's out of order. And really what they just did is they gave us the season 1 finale, and then they gave us the 2 episodes that go before that, and now the episode that's after that. Which,
yes.
Okay, that's fine. I kind of wish they just put them all in order, but it is what it is. But that having been said, Jay, you want to go ahead and read the summary for this episode?
Yes, definitely keeps us on our toes, that's for sure. Cad Bane successfully broke Ziro the Hutt out of prison by taking several senators hostage. Once returned to Nal Hutta, Ziro threatens the Hutt Council that should anything happen to him, a diary detailing all their crimes will end up in the hands of the Republic. Snootles, the Palawick dancer made famous in Return of the Jedi, finds Ziro in his cell and offers her sympathy as a former romantic partner. Together, they break out of prison and visit Ziro's mother to acquire a starship. However, after Ziro retrieves his diary from his father's grave, Snootles turns on him, shoots him, and retrieves his diary. Meanwhile, the bounty hunter Cad Bane and Jedi Knights Obi-Wan Kenobi and Quinlan Vos clash after their own pursuit for Ziro comes up empty. In the end, Snootles turns over Ziro's diary to Jabba the Hutt and brags about how she accomplished what bounty hunters could not.
Well
Sorry,
done.
I couldn't resist.
No, that's good. I'm not brave enough to do the Ziro impression, so I'm just gonna skip over that. This is a fun episode. I really like this episode, and what's funny about it is that Ziro is so annoying, and when you first encounter Snootles in this, you're like, oh, do we really have to put up with that voice? But it turns out really well, and this debuts Quinlan Vos. We'll talk about him somewhere there, and we get back to having Obi-Wan action after largely being absent for the last several episodes. But what are your overall thoughts on this episode?
I definitely appreciate this episode now a lot more than I did on the very first viewing way back in the day, because I know we've talked about this several times before. When these episodes first came out, I was basically gobbling them all up because my own kids were so small at the time that I was just digesting Star Wars. And I will never forget when, and I know I've shared this story before, my husband looked at me and goes, "What the heck are you watching, Jay?" Because it truly is. I mean, like you pointed out with Snootles' voice and then Ziro's voice and the whole thing. But honestly, like I said, I've really come to appreciate this episode for a few different reasons. One specifically is just seeing Quinlan Vos and Obi-Wan in action together. And we've gotten so much more of Quinlan Vos, obviously, in the Star Wars lore and fandom since this, which I'm very thankful for. But then after watching the featurette and just being reminded of the genius that Dave Filoni is and all the inspiration that he brought to this, it really does feel like a gangster
Yeah.
movie or something right out of the musical Chicago, which I love. So, for that reason, I definitely, like you said, it's just a lot of fun. So I'm really glad that we revisited this. But what were your thoughts?
I echo a lot of the things that you say. I think what makes this episode good is, of course, the introduction of Quinlan Vos. We get to see Obi-Wan and Quinlan fight Cad Bane, and that's a really cool action scene at the end of this. But
Mhm.
it is it's Sice Noodles flipping our expectations here, going from someone who's kind of bumbling looking and almost a little bit of an airhead at the beginning of this episode to someone who was actually very cunning and
Yes.
accomplishing something here at the end. And they kind of pull the rug out from underneath us with her, and I really appreciated that. And I've seen this episodes a number of times, but when we're doing the discussion of these rewatches, when you really pay the attention and you really see how she set up Zero at the beginning of this, when you're paying attention and it's coming and you pay attention to those details. But we'll
Mhm.
get into that a little bit as we go through. So again, we're picking up after the season 1 finale where Cad Bane and his assortment of other bounty hunters had shown up at the Senate, and they take Amidala and a bunch of other senators hostage. Anakin's there because he's on vacation or sabbatical or whatever it was, and he sneaks in to see Padme. And next thing you know, they're all he lost his lightsaber. She has it, and he's trying to rescue them, and things go sideways. But then ultimately, at the end, Cad Bane gets what he wants and gets Zero out of prison, and then they leave.
Mhm.
And so now the Jedi Council has appointed Obi-Wan with the assistance of Quinlan Vos to go get Zero back and to get Cad Bane. And you mentioned it earlier, this is our introduction to this character. Were you familiar with him before you saw this episode?
I actually was, and not because of maybe where you think.
Mhm.
I don't remember exactly where I heard of Quinlan Vos the first time, but I actually have a picture from Star Wars Celebration back in Los Angeles in 2007
Mm.
of a cosplayer in the Quinlan Vos cosplay, and I just thought it was the coolest character ever. Didn't really know anything about him,
Mhm.
so I guess that's my introduction to the character, even though I didn't really know anything about him. But
Right.
what was your first introduction?
Well, I remember years and years and years ago, and I didn't check to see when all this came out, but I want to say it was the Force.net had an article about how Dark Horse Comics were going to be starting some new comics featuring this Jedi, Quinlan Vos, who was a background character in the Phantom Menace. And in fact, he was like sitting at a table when Sebulba is threatening Anakin. I think that's where he's supposed to be.
Ah,
And
yes, yes.
they developed Quinlan Vos out of this background character, and they turned this whole thing. And apparently, from there, he caught George Lucas's attention. Now, his appearance in those comics is there's some inspiration taken from that, but this guy here is not quite the same guy that we get to see in Dark Horse comics, which are now Legends and stuff like that. Both are
Mhm.
great interpretations as far as I'm concerned, but those comics were pretty dark that Quinlan was in, and he was kind of a fill-in master for Aayla Secura as well, which
Mhm.
doesn't really happen in our current continuity. So
Okay.
yeah, I was familiar with that character, and it was exciting to get him. And like so many other things that had been brought in from Legends, they get the core of the character, but they change him to suit the needs of the current storyline. And
Sure.
I'm good with that. So I just did think it was interesting that George Lucas kind of came fascinated with Aayla Secura and put her directly in Revenge of the Sith, and then
Yeah.
makes mention of Quinlan Vos and in Revenge of the Sith when Anakin runs into Obi-Wan's briefing as it's over and like everyone's leaving, and Obi-Wan says like in short the sieges are going well, and Master Vos has his troops at like what Boss Petty or something like that.
Pity. Yep. Mhm.
So that's where we get to know him from. But okay, so I think it's kind of fun that we get this like personality contrast between Quinlan and Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan is, I don't want to say he's like 100% by the book, but he's kind of like the standard bearer for what a Jedi is. Meanwhile, Quinlan is kind of like the rogue frontier Jedi before Kanan Jarrus was the cowboy Jedi.
Yeah, there you
Here,
go.
he shows up at the landing pad and jumps out of the LAAT and lands in front of Obi-Wan, and Obi-Wan just doing everything he can not to roll his eyes at him. But what, tell me a little bit more about what you thought about Quinlan overall in this episode.
Oh, he's fascinating. I mean, I just love him. He's fantastic. Very flamboyant. And like you said, here's Obi-Wan, Mr. By the Book, and he already has a Padawan or had a Padawan in Anakin that was very well, all I can think of is Attack of the Clones, when he stole the speeder and they're going after the bounty hunter and all that jazz. And he even says to Quinlan, if you were as concerned about being on time as you would sticking the landing. I just thought that was such a great line.
Mm-hmm.
And not wanting Quinlan to be the one to pilot, even though Obi-Wan hates flying, of course, he would much rather be in the pilot seat and be the one in control. So I really love that. And the contrast, I think, between Quinlan and Obi-Wan definitely works in this episode because it reminds you very much of the good cop, bad cop kind of, dynamic that you see in a lot of those, cop kind of movies where you get like the bad boys sort of thing. And so I thought the chemistry worked, and I love Quinlan. And I love the idea that he has the psychometry,
Mm-hmm.
which I know we're going to talk about a little bit more. So, but I'll stop there for now. That's my overall general thoughts of Quinlan.
Yeah. So I don't think Quinlan Vos really shows up in any major role in the Clone Wars after this. This is kind of like his highlight episode. But then he becomes a key player in Dark Disciple, which you and I are very fond of. And then he develops a relationship with Asajj Ventress, which gets referenced in the Tales of the Underworld series that they did last year. And Obi-Wan even makes reference to Quinlan Vos in the Obi-Wan Kenobi series when he's in that safe house for that path that is smuggling Force sensitives around, and he sees that. I don't know exactly what it says, but in my mind is always Quinlan Vos was here, etched into the wall in that area that he's hiding. So we know he's still around after the Clone Wars, but apparently survived Order 66 and is now part of the Jedi version of the Underground Railroad. But at any rate, and then like you may mention, he's got that psychometry ability, which we get to see in the Jedi Fallen Order game with Cal Kestis.
Yes.
And used in a major way. He only gets to use it once in this episode. The episode guide said that the original script had him using it a second time, but it just didn't make it into the final product. But talk a little bit about the psychometry. I know you're very fond of this power.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I've often went on record as saying that if I could choose any one force power, this would be it, in that you can touch an object and the force is said to kind of resonate within that object, so you can actually figure out the history, who's touched it or what happened with that particular object, and locations and all kinds of things. And that just fascinates me just because of the fact that I love the idea of history. And so I just think it's such a cool force ability to have. Sometimes I think it could be definitely a blessing and a curse because a lot of the emotions come with it, as well as we see in Dark Disciple, for example. And those emotions can be very raw, very deep, very vivid, and also very traumatic. So it's, like I said, it can come with a price, but I just think it's a really, really cool ability.
Yeah. And Quinlan has really got a hold on it. And he uses it quite well because it's part of his investigative technique when they end up on Nal Hutta, and we'll get into that in just a bit. All right, so that's the background on Quinlan. So he and Obi-Wan set off on their mission, and Quinlan's going to fly, which Obi-Wan's not excited about. It's about as bad as Anakin flying for him. But then we go to Nal Hutta. And I love the start of this whole thing because there's this big opening dance number with these Twi'lek women that have these big Hutt headdress type things on, and they're doing a routine that introduces Snootles. And it's inspired by the opening dance sequence in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Anything goes. I mean, you can almost hear them singing that in Huttese. And so I thought that was fun, a great callback. However, I have to ask you, were you a little surprised at all surprised by the appearance of these Twi'lek women who really weren't wearing all that much? And I'm of two minds about it because it's essentially a version of Leia's middle bikini from Return of the Jedi. And plenty of kids have seen that movie. However, it's a bit more seductive, I suppose, here. And, they really, whereas Leia was forced to do that against her will, and ultimately she defeats Jabba while doing it and stuff like that. And you can tell, I mean, there's not a whole lot seductive going on with her in that situation. But yeah, anyways, I'm not talking about this artfully. What did you think about that?
The thing of it is, I believe that Clone Wars, when it came out, and the whole vibe of the Clone Wars is so different from a lot of the other animated series that we've gotten. And we've talked about this so many times in the past. I mean, you're talking about things like the clones having the old-fashioned World War II artwork on their ships, things like Padme, for example,
Right.
being very scantily clad. There's been some references to, things like that. There have been other Twi'leks that have walked around very scantily clad. And I'm not saying that it's necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, but I just think it's part of the storytelling. And like you pointed out, this is inspired by Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, which was a PG or PG-13 maybe movie
First
at the
PG-13
time.
movie. Yeah.
Was it the first one?
It was.
That's a very cool piece of trivia that I didn't know, and now I do. Thank you very much.
Mhm.
But yeah, at any rate, I didn't think that it was awful. And you think about all of the different kinds of things that we've seen in the Clone Wars, not just this kind of stuff, but I'm thinking specifically about spoiler alert, watching Ahsoka behead 7 Mandalorians at once with her lightsaber. Those kinds of things. So, I guess my short answer is I didn't really think anything of it.
Okay, that's fair enough. And to be clear, I'm not trying to be prudish about this.
Oh,
I mean,
sure. No, I get it.
it doesn't really bother me, except that there just isn't when it comes to romance, when it comes to that type of thing in this, Star Wars can be a bit more prudish in the Clone Wars and stuff like that, because kids are a key part of the audience for this. Now, the show does certainly grow up with its audience over across 6 seasons, 7 seasons when it's all said and done. And so that's fine. But like I said, it's just this time I forgot about that scene and as soon as it started, I was like, oh yeah, this. I was like, huh, that's interesting that they went that route. And I mean, it doesn't particularly bother me, and I don't remember having an issue with this when I showed it to my kids all those years ago, but when they were much younger. But at any rate, it still just did kind of surprise me a little bit that it showed up. But
Yeah, it's funny that you say that, though, not to go down that rabbit hole, but there's a lot of times where, like you, when we rewatch some of these episodes, I do kind of get taken aback just a little bit because it is such a different storytelling than what we have gotten in things like Rebels and even The Bad Batch.
yeah, well, even think about it this way, is that they're not always terribly consistent with like the violence. And for instance, I know like A New Hope got recut so that when they get to the detention block and they're getting Leia and they have that shootout, they altered things just by a couple seconds so that you don't always see the blaster bolts hitting the stormtroopers or the Imperial officers. You see you all of a sudden see them falling down with maybe a blaster bolt in their chest or whatever. And then in this episode, and the reason why I brought up that scene is because I felt like they almost did the same thing here. When Snootles turns on Ziro and shoots him, we see from, if I remember this correctly, and no one needs to comment if I get it quite wrong. But I remember this perspective is that, she pulls out the blaster and she turns to shoot. And then we see her looking off screen towards us as she fires the shots. And then we get a shot of Ziro after he's been shot and he's falling over. We don't actually see the blaster bolts hit him and kill him in that situation.
Mhm.
So again, it's just it's weird where they decide to draw the line at times. And maybe there's a limit to how much of that stuff they can do. And so and that's why it may not be consistent across episodes, but because they're trying to preserve a certain rating. And if you have too much of anything, it's going to cause an issue. So anyway,
Right.
speculation on my part.
Yeah. Well, it's the same thing with Asajj Ventress, killing that clone while she was kissing him. That was censored for a while. And then now it's back. So yeah.
Yeah, we definitely spent some time talking about that.
We did.
So. Okay, so after the dance number, and we've got to meet Snootles as she sings the Huttese version of Anything Goes. I'd love to get the actual translation of that, but they didn't provide it. And we get to meet the 5 Hutt families here on Nal Hutta. Now, Jabba's not there. He's being represented by his cousin Gardula. But the other leaders are Aruba, Marlo, Arok, and Gorga. And we spent some time in our last Clone Wars conversation kind of talking about how they were modeled after Marlon Brando and other people who are playing gangsters in those old 70s, 60s gangster type movies. But Ziro is addressing them. And as we said in the summary, he understands why he was broken out of jail, because he's not stupid. He may be annoying, but he's not stupid. And that it's because he's got this holo diary that details all their crimes. And if he didn't have that, he'd probably be left to rot in prison. For one reason, he set up Rhoda the Hutt, that the kidnapping there, and that Jabba was furious with him. But should anything happen to him, then that holodiary will end up on the steps of the Senate before his body's even cold, is what he basically tells them. So they better take good care of him, and he's going to go check out his accommodation. He hopes are satisfactory. Well, his accommodations are a jail cell there in the Nal Hutta and Gardula's palace there. But this is where all of the treachery and the trickery and stuff starts to come in. And the next thing we know, we got Snootles going to see Ziro and kind of expressing her dismay that he just kind of up and left her, and revealing that these two are a romantic couple. What did you think about all that?
Well, again, this is the part where it was a little cringy the first time around, not gonna lie, especially when Snootles starts talking about how she missed him or loved him all the way down to, her in her fluid sac instead of her heart, the bottom of her heart. Little crazy there. So, Ziro I've always thought that he was kind of a bumbling gangster, and you give him a lot of credit for being smart to the extent that he knows that he's got this diary, this blackmail that he can hold over the 5 Hutt families. But I guess my question has always been, why does he want to be so treacherous against his family members? What's the impetus to this for Ziro, and why is he such a black sheep, and what made him decide to turn his back on the Hutt families in that way? Because obviously, as Obi-Wan points out to Quinlan, that the Hutts are their allies. And even when they go to the Mama Hutt's house, and Quinlan just starts kind of breaking in and doing all these things, Obi-Wan's like, Quinlan, someone lives here. I can hear him say, this is so uncivilized kind of thing. So, but getting back to your original question with Ziro, he always leaves me a little cringy feeling. And I kind of am, I shouldn't say happy that he got his comeuppance, but he got his just desserts. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I think he was designed to be cringy. It's
100%.
Unlike Jar Jar, who was intended to be comedic, Ziro is intended to be cringy in this. And Dave even talks about, it's like, who are these people, right?
Yes.
But the in that episode guide. But I think what has happened here with Ziro, and it was a bigger deal in Legends than I think it is in the current continuity with Star Wars. How the Hutts, they are ruled by these 5 families, in Legends, they were a bit more willing to turn on each other in order to personally profit and make deals because they are gangsters in this situation. Rhoda is a lesser Hutt when it comes down to it. He doesn't have, he's cousins with Jabba, but he doesn't have Jabba's stature. He doesn't have Jabba's wealth. And so he cut a deal with the Separatists way back in the Clone Wars movie so that they could get to Rhoda and use him Rhoda could be used as a hostage to try and get the Hutts to ally with the Separatists in the situation. Of course, that got found out. Jabba was furious, and if it hadn't been for the presence of Jedi and the like, Jabba might have arranged his assassination right then. But once he was in prison, Ziro was thinking ahead, which is that he needed an insurance policy, and the insurance policy was this diary. So he had the goods on these guys. In Jabba, even being more devious, is like, I don't want this over my head anymore. So I'll get him out, and I'll arrange for, once we get the diary, then I'll arrange for his demise. And so, I think it's Ziro got caught playing a game and trying to get stature in this, and he got it in over his head because he's not as clever as Jabba. Jabba was one step ahead of him on this whole thing once he figured out what was going on. So I think that's the answer to that question there. But getting back to Snootles a little bit, as I said when I was talking about my thoughts about this, is that when I first watched this, I was loving the Quinlan and the Obi-Wan part and the Cad Bane part of it, not so much the Snootles and Ziro's part, but this time just really paying attention. When after the big dance routine, Sai goes backstage and she's kind of talking to the Twi'lek dancers as well, and one of them mentions that Ziro's there, and Sai sits up straight. Ziro's here, and so she goes charging off to meet him. But here's the other thing: it's like Snootles is not attractive at all, but she is to the Hutts, right? And to like the other alien species there. And I mean, beauty's in the eye of the beholder, and we have much more of a human sense of beauty because we're humans. But she shows up in the prison wing of Gardula's hut, Gardula the Hutt's palace. That was hard to say for some reason. And, gets the Gamorreans, the stupid Gamorreans fighting. It's like, Gardula wants to know which one of you is stronger. And then she gets past them and she tells the next Gamorrean, they're fighting, do something about it. So she kind of comes off at first glance as being this bumbling character, but then you watch her manipulate Ziro. She's asking questions about the diary and going to get the diary and stuff like this. And her beauty in attention is flattering Ziro. And she plays him up like the Lauren, lover in this situation. It's like, how could you have left me behind in this? And though he's like, oh, I regret it, and I didn't mean to do it. And, and so, but we'll get out, we'll be together. Of course, I'm paraphrasing and all this. And she's just playing him like a fiddle this entire time.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And again, that goes back to what I was referencing earlier that Dave Filoni was talking about with those classic gangster movies. And again, the musical Chicago. You think about those kinds of things too, and the way that these different women were very cunning when it came to acting one way, but yet they really had an ulterior motive in store. And you definitely see Snootles in a different light when you watch Return of the Jedi after this. That's for sure.
Oh, yeah. Well, and, the other thing is that there was that story about Snootles and from a certain point of view. And the Max Rebo story where, I don't know, it's not quite as consistent with this. I mean, she kind of comes off as goofy and silly here, but not to the degree that she does in other places.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay, so once they're out, Ziro and Sai head to Mama the Hutt. This is Ziro's mother's place so that he can get a ship. I don't even know what to say about Mama the Hutt. I mean, she's absolutely gigantic, obese beyond belief. Has got this deep, almost masculine voice. What do you take away from her appearance?
Oh my goodness. You think that she must be the kicked to the curb relative, of the Hutts. And which may explain a little bit of why Ziro is the way that he is. but she seems to, in one way, miss her son, and then the other side of the coin, she's calling him a dirtbag.
Mhm.
So, but I think it's just playing on a classic trope kind of thing, and so it just adds a little bit of a layer of that family essence for Zero and a little bit more to his backstory. Do you think, just a quick aside, do you think that we'll get any kind of flashback kind of thing in The Mandalorian and Grogu when it comes to, seeing Road to the Hut and then flashing back maybe in hologram form to the olden days of this kind of stuff?
I mean, anything's possible. I mean, flashbacks weren't a thing until The Force Awakens, and then they were, right?
Mhm. Yeah,
So,
exactly.
I just looked it up. I would never would have guessed this, but Nika Futterman did Cy Snootles' voice.
Really?
Yeah, and
Wow.
for those listening at home and aren't putting two and two together, she does Asajj Ventress's voice.
Yes, I was just gonna say, we were just talking about Asajj, and that's talk about, a 6 degrees of separation kind of thing character-wise, Quinlan Vos.
Yeah,
Wow,
yeah.
I
I
never
mean,
would have
weird.
guessed that.
Yeah, I mean, and then Corey Burton, who does Cad Bane, is doing Ziro the Hutt as well. So talk about some range.
Wow. Yeah, no
But at any
doubt.
rate,
These voice actors are so talented.
yeah, I thought Quinlan Voss's voice sounded familiar, but that's Al Rodrigo, and I can't place anything that he has done. So that's a new one. Yeah, so yeah, Mama the Hutt, she was something, and but
Yeah.
then we get the fight between Cad Bane and Quinlan Voss and Obi-Wan there. Cad really held his own against two Jedi.
Mhm. He's always such an impressive fighter, though,
Mhm.
and it was so great to get his backstory in Tales of the Underworld as well, because that just lended that much more to it. But yes, he always holds his own very impressively.
Mhm. Yeah. And I mean, the other thing that he's got going for him is that he's got all the gadgets there. When
Oh,
the
yeah.
Jedi are using the Force and their lightsabers, I did think it was funny when Toto tried to charge Obi-Wan with Quinlan's lightsaber.
Yes.
Obi-Wan just kind of olayed and pulled it out of his hands and then had two lightsabers. But at any rate, he's grappling with Obi-Wan, and Obi-Wan almost gets him right where he wants him, and then Cad starts shocking him. He keeps pulling out all the tricks. Just when he loses his guns, he's got flamethrowers or
Mhm.
other electro darts and the various things. So yeah, very resourceful. I really liked Cad Bane in this episode. You could tell how perturbed he was, like, so done with having to do anything with Ziro the Hutt. He was, because he did the mission to get the Senate floor plans from R2 and 3PO a couple episodes ago, and then he busted Zero out. And of course, he had to spend time with this guy who we didn't like. And then Zero busts out. And I'll give Cad this. He's really smart. He knows it wasn't the Jedi who got them out, who
Oh,
got
for
Zero out
sure.
of there. And
Mhm.
then, he's never tires of making money. But the interaction he's had with the Hutts is like, it's tired of taking your money. I'll do it. My schedule's
Mhm.
open. And so then he goes after this, and he also just has that one line about how much professional is. It's like, I really hate it when other people do my job. When who he
Yes.
discovers that Zero's been killed. So a lot of good, subtle character moments for Cad Bane in this episode.
Oh, for sure, and you could tell that he was all like you said, he was just so over all of this mission
Mhm.
and dealing with the Hutts in general, and as far as bounty hunters go, there's a lot of bounty hunters, like he said, "I've got time in my schedule," but he really could pick and choose who he does his jobs for, because it's
Mhm.
almost like the same sort of thing as Obi-Wan, where things are just n like, so uncivilized. Cat is just, I don't even wanna deal with this kind of
Yep.
thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Love that.
And then the whole episode ends with Sisnul's going to Tatooine and getting her reward from Jabba the Hutt. He turns over the diary. So this was all engineered by Jabba. Jabba did not want Zero free, but did not want Zero having evidence over his head. And so he
Mhm.
got him out. And then but he didn't know where the evidence was. And then we found out that it was in Zero's father's grave, tucked under his little mummified arm. And once he had that, he off Zero. So he never had to worry about that guy again. You know, in the movies, Jabba has a reputation as being like the vile gangster Jabba the Hutt. But what do we really see of him? Someone who throws tantrums in Return of the Jedi and kind of falls asleep and bumbles a little bit in The Phantom Menace. But
Mhm.
he really gets an opportunity to display his how cunning and how devious he can be here in the Clone Wars.
Yes, and I think just in general, the Hutts have a reputation like that, that they just like their look suggests is that they're just a bunch of slugs, that
Mhm.
they're just gangster slugs. But as you pointed out, in Jabba's case, he's also very cunning. And I also have to say too that I appreciated this episode overall because of the depth of the world building, I guess you could
Mhm.
say, from the, Jabba's palace, and a lot of shadows and a lot of smoke and fog and that kind of thing. And that's super hard to depict, I would think, on an animated type of a story. And just the lighting and everything, I just thought was just so spot on.
Yeah, yeah, indeed. It was Nal Hutta. I don't know if they've carried this over into beyond Legends, but in Legends it was I think it's like the jewel, the crown jewel, or something like that is what it meant in Huttese, despite the fact that they have so polluted this world that really
Mhm.
not much can survive on it anymore. And so, that's why they've extended their operations to other worlds. They think Nal Hutta is great, but they're big slugs, like you said, and they can live in the slime. But it is the result of all this industrial pollution that they've created in the name of profits and their scheming.
Yeah, kind of
So,
ironic.
indeed. All right. Okay. Well, trying to think if there's anything that we haven't touched on that we need to go over before we wrap this up. Is there anything else that you want to talk about before we put a bow on it?
I don't think so. Just once again, it was great to get this adventure with Quinlan and Obi-Wan at the helm, and as you said, great action with Cad Bane. And as much as it was cringy to see Sai and Zero, it was also very, very fun too.
Indeed. Indeed. All right, then. Well, with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up this episode of Podcast Stardust and our discussion of this episode of the Clone Wars. We hope you've enjoyed it. And if you want to make sure that you get all of our discussions of the Clone Wars going forward, make sure you've hit that subscribe button on your podcatcher of choice. And once you've done that, we'd appreciate it if you could rate and review the show. That does help us out and get the show in front of more people. And if you want to catch the entire back catalog, all previous 996 shows, best place you can do that is over at retrozap.com. That's the home of the podcast, as well as all the other shows that are on the podcast, Retrozap Podcast Network. Jay, you want to go ahead and remind everybody what our social media contacts are?
Sure thing. So you can hit us up on our Facebook and Instagram pages at Podcast Stardust. And we do maintain some Pinterest boards for some fun ideas for everything Star Wars. And we also have our 2 YouTube outlets. So that is YouTube and YouTube Music. No videos, just audio, but you can still join in the fun and subscribe to those and share those out with your friends. And then please email us. So we have our email address, which is podcaststardust@gmail.com. We are just about to our 1000th episode, and we are still looking for listener questions, any memories that you have, or anything that you'd like to say. And we'd like that by this Thursday so that we can include that in our 1000th episode. So you can send those to our email or hit us up on our social media outlets that I just mentioned as well. And then last but not least, you can check out the link in our show notes that will take you to our TeePublic store, where you can pick out one of 7 different show logo designs available for Podcast Stardust on all kinds of fun things, from t-shirts and sweatshirts and coffee mugs, as well as some other fun things as well.
All right. You want to go ahead and fill everybody in on what's going on with cosplay?
I would love to. So my Instagram, which is at j.snipscosplay, is where you will find all of my adventures for my Star Wars characters, including Ahsoka, 2 different versions of Hera, my Force sister, my original concept Mandalorian, and a lot of other fun things as well. And keep checking out my stories and things. I'm going to be advertising or promoting, I guess you could say, a lot of fun stuff I have going on, including Fan Expo Cleveland next month in March.
All right. Upcoming on the show, we are going to be getting to our review of Master of Evil by Adam Christopher on Wednesday. And then Friday, we are wrapping up the week with some Star Wars news. And then the following week, we're kicking off things with our 1000th episode. So make sure you join us all for that. With all that said, thanks for listening to episode 997 of Podcast Stardust, everyone. Have a great week. And until next time, may the Force be with you.